The letter arrived on a Thursday, and Mira Fenn read it twice before she understood what it meant. The first time, she read it the way she read everything her employer left on the office desk. Quickly, accurately, without letting the words land. Her father, Thomas Fenn, magistrate of Whitmore Parish, had a habit of leaving correspondence half-opened and half-forgotten, and it had been Mira's job since she was 14 to complete what he started. She sorted his case files, recorded his depositions, indexed his rulings. She had a memory for words the way some people have a memory for faces. Read a document once, and it lived in her, down to the punctuation. The second time she read the letter, her hands went still. It was from the solicitor of Evander Cray, the Earl of Dunmore. It requested the hand of Miss Miriam Fenn in marriage. The price offered was £4,000, payable to Thomas Fenn upon completion of the ceremony. At the bottom, in her father's handwriting, not the shaking afternoon scrawl she knew so well, but the deliberate morning hand he used when he wanted something to look official, were the words, "Agreed and witnessed, this date." He had already signed it. He had not told her. He had signed a contract for her marriage, accepted £4,000 for her, and left the letter on his desk with a cup of cold tea sitting on top of it. The tea had left a ring on the paper. She could see it. A brown circle, right across the solicitor's signature, as though the whole transaction was so ordinary it did not require a clean surface. Mira set the letter down and pressed her fingers flat on the desk until she could feel the grain of the wood. She was 23 years old. She had given the last 9 years of her life to this house, to these files, to a man whose hands shook too badly by noon to hold a pen. She had read every case that crossed this desk. She had opened the door to creditors and bailiffs and constables, and handled each of them with a patience she did not feel. She had watched her father drink away the furniture, and then the horses, and then her mother's silver brooch, the last thing they had from her mother. She had watched him make debts the way other men made promises, easily, without thinking of what they cost. £4,000. That was what she was worth to him. She heard him in the hall. He came in without knocking. It was his study, after all, and stopped when he saw her standing behind the desk. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. That was something. Not much, but something. "You'll be a countess," he said. Most women would be grateful. Mira said nothing. She looked at the tea ring on the letter, and the ring looked back at her, and she understood that there was no version of this conversation that would change anything. The contract was signed. The money was already spent, most likely, on something she would never see. She had work to do. The Earl of Dunmore had not been seen in public in 18 months. This was the first thing Mira confirmed, not from the letter, which said nothing about it, but from 3 separate case files that had crossed her father's desk in the previous year. A boundary dispute on the northern edge of the Dunmore estate, settled in absentia. A tenant complaint, answered by the Earl's steward. A road maintenance bill, signed by proxy. The Earl of Dunmore had been managing his affairs from inside his house for a year and a half, without showing his face to anyone. The county called him the Broken Earl. They said it with different voices. The gentry said it with a kind of careful sympathy that meant nothing. The farmers on his land said it with something closer to worry. A landlord who could not be seen or spoken to was a landlord who could not be reasoned with. And an estate that ran entirely on steward's orders was an estate where things fell through the cracks. The house servant said nothing at all, which was the most telling of any of them. 18 months ago, Evander Cray had been thrown from his horse on the east road near Dunmore village. He had been found by a farmhand 2 hours later. The report filed at her father's office, which Mira had copied and indexed, because she copied and indexed everything, described a man unconscious in a drainage ditch with a head wound that the attending physician said was consistent with a fall. He had survived. He had not, as far as anyone could tell, been the same since. Mira packed one trunk. She did not say goodbye to the house. She had lived in it for 23 years, and it had never quite felt like hers. The carriage from Dunmore arrived before dawn. The coachman wore grey livery and said nothing. She climbed inside. The house disappeared behind the turn of the lane. Dunmore Hall was 4 hours north, and the landscape changed as they went, farmland giving way to moorland, wide skies to narrow ones. The road wound between stone walls, and then, through a valley that was still in shadow when the carriage turned through a pair of iron gates, and began the approach to the house. It was large and severe, built of dark stone, 3 wings arranged around a central courtyard that was as neat and purposeful as a military parade ground. No ornamentation, no softness. The grounds were maintained to the edge of severity, hedges trimmed, gravel raked, not a fallen leaf in sight, but the effect was not welcoming. It was controlled. It was the look of a house that had decided some time ago to stop trying to appear anything other than what it was. A woman met her at the door, Mrs. Ord, the housekeeper, with grey hair and the bearing of someone who had managed difficult situations for a long time and expected to continue managing them indefinitely. She curtsied with precise correctness and led Mira inside without unnecessary conversation. The entrance hall was cold despite the season and enormous, and hung with portraits of men who all had the same jaw. Mira looked at them as she walked. One face repeated in 3 different paintings, younger in each, she thought, or perhaps more open-faced, with dark eyes and a mouth that seemed to be trying not to smile. She filed the face in the part of her mind where she kept things that might matter later. He was in the library. She knew before Mrs. Ord opened the door, the same small shift in the housekeeper's posture that she had seen in her father's clerks when he was in a bad mood, and they knew it. A stiffening, a careful management of expression. The door swung open. Evan de Cray, the Earl of Dunmore, was standing at the window with his back to her. He was taller than she expected and broader through the shoulders. His hair was dark, going silver at the temple, though he could not have been more than 35. He held one hand braced against the window frame, palm flat on the stone, and he was looking at the courtyard below with the concentrated stillness of a man who was using the view to think about something other than the view. He did not turn. Miss Fenn. His voice was low and precise, and it landed in the room without warmth. The ceremony will take place tomorrow. I see no reason to delay. Mr. Strath will explain the household arrangements. Dinner is at 7. He was already moving toward the interior door as he said it, not looking at her, not looking at anything except the middle distance and the path that took him out of the room. Mira watched him go. She noticed that his left hand, the one that had braced against the window frame, was gripping the next door frame as he passed through it. The knuckles were white. He released the frame when he was clear of it, and his hand dropped to his side, and he was gone. She thought about that grip all the way up the stairs. The wedding was the next morning in the small chapel at the edge of the estate grounds. The chapel was old and cold, and smelled of stone and tallow, and the only witnesses were Mrs. Ord, a young footman named Reed who kept his eyes fixed on a spot above the altar, and a woman Mira did not recognize, sitting in the front pew with the erect posture of someone who had decided that personal difficulty was not a legitimate reason to slouch. Lady Maron, Evander said, when he noticed Mira's glance. My mother's cousin. She is staying with us at present. The woman looked at Mira with the clinical attention of a person who spent a great deal of time assessing things and very little time pretending she wasn't. Mira met her eyes and held them. The vicar said the words. Evander spoke his vows to a point somewhere to Mira's left, and when the moment came for the ring, he took her hand with a care that surprised her. Not the absent, perfunctory grip she had expected, but something deliberate, as though he were locating her hand by feel rather than sight, which made no sense because he was looking directly at it. The ring slid into place with exact, unhurried precision. She tucked the observation away. After the ceremony, he walked her to the east corridor and stopped there with one hand on the carved newel post of the staircase. His grip on the wood was the same as the window frame, the same whitening at the knuckles. The east rooms are yours, I keep to the west. Mr. Strath manages the household accounts. He will answer your questions. He turned, and then stopped, his free hand finding the wall beside him, and he stood there for one breath with his eyes closed before he let go of the wall and walked away. Mira stood at the bottom of the stairs and watched him go, and knew she had just seen something he had not meant to show her. Her rooms were beautiful in a way that felt almost apologetic. Fresh flowers, a good fire, a desk stocked with paper and ink, and 3 different varieties of pen. A bookcase ran the full length of one wall. Someone had arranged the books by subject. Law on the left, natural philosophy in the centre, novels to the right. And the arrangement was so exactly suited to her that she stood in front of it for a moment, slightly unsettled, as though the room had been waiting for her specifically. "What happened to his lordship?" she asked Mrs. Ord when she left. The housekeeper's face closed like a book. "We do not speak of it, my lady." The door clicked shut. Dinner was an exercise in careful silence. The table was long. Evander sat at one end, Mira at the other, and Lady Maren sat between them with the expression of someone watching a chess game whose outcome she had already calculated. Evander ate with methodical exactness, never reaching for the wrong glass, never losing the position of anything on the table. And Mira watched him across the candlelight and thought about door frames and window frames and the particular quality of the grip on the newel post, and said nothing. When the plates were cleared, Evander thanked her for her company in the voice of a man reading from a script he had memorized, and excused himself. Lady Maren lingered. She sat across the table with her wine glass in one hand and the expression of a woman who was going to say something, whether or not it was invited. "He was not always like this," she said finally. Mira waited, before the accident. Maren turned her glass slowly. "He was not easy. He was never easy, but he was present. He was managing the estate, corresponding with Parliament, taking his seat in the Lords. He had plans." She set the glass down. "Now he manages nothing he cannot do from inside this house. He hasn't been past the front gate in 18 months. What do the physicians say?" "Various things. He doesn't keep them long enough to say anything useful." Mira looked at the empty chair at the end of the table. The wineglass sat exactly where Evander had placed it when he arrived, not moved by so much as an inch throughout the meal. "He doesn't move anything," she said. "Things he reaches for, he always knows exactly where they are." Maren looked at her with a sharpness that was not unkind. "Yes." She paused as though deciding something. "Yes, he does." She said nothing else, and left shortly afterward, and Mira sat alone at the empty table with the candles burning down and a feeling she could not yet name. She found him in the study at the back of the east wing. 3 nights later, when she came looking for a law reference she'd been unable to locate in her own rooms. She had not expected to find anyone. The study was dark except for the lamp on the desk, and Evander was sitting at it with a map spread open before him, his forehead resting on his hand, and his eyes closed. He looked, for one unguarded moment, like a man who was very tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She must have made a sound. His head came up. The expression was gone instantly. Whatever she had seen was folded away, and the careful blankness she was beginning to recognize replaced it. "Forgive me," he made to rise. "Don't." She crossed to the shelves on the far wall and ran her finger along the spines. She found the volume she wanted. "I came for Blackstones. I can go." He didn't ask her to stay. She stayed anyway, because the silence in the room was not unfriendly, and she had spent enough time in magistrates' offices to know that sometimes a quiet presence was what a person needed without knowing they needed it. She sat in the chair by the window and opened her book. Evander looked at his map. After a while, he said quietly and without looking up, "You read case law. My father is a magistrate." She kept her eyes on the page. "I have read everything that passed through his office. Every deposition, every ruling, every lease, every sealed report." He was still. Then he said, "There is a matter of a tenant dispute on the north boundary I have not been able to resolve. Fowler claims the irrigation rights extend to the eastern mill. The Hardacre family disputes it. The original grant is in the 3rd case file on the left shelf. She found it, read it, and the answer was plain on the 2nd page. The irrigation rights ended at the mill pond, not the mill. She said so. He asked her to read the relevant section again. She did. He was quiet for a moment, and then he asked her to read the Hardacre deed of occupancy that was in the same file. She read for an hour. He listened. By the time the clock in the hall struck 10, she had resolved 2 disputes and caught a surveyor's error that had been generating neighbour complaints for 3 years. Evander had stopped looking at his map. "You have a remarkable memory," he said. It was not a compliment exactly. It was the assessment of a man recalibrating something. "I remember everything I read." She closed the last file, verbatim if necessary. "Every case my father decided, every document he signed, every sealed report." She had not planned to add the last part. She did not take it back. Evander was very still for a moment. Then carefully he said, "There is one more file in the bottom drawer. I would be grateful if you would read that one as well." She read it, and then the one beneath it. The clock struck 11, and then midnight, and neither of them moved to end it. Mr. Strath appeared at the door with a letter on a tray, and his face had that same quality of contained alarm that Mrs. Ords had whenever she approached the west wing. He handed the letter to Evander and withdrew. Evander's hand closed on the letter without opening it. His jaw tightened. He said the name without looking up. Mrs. Octavia Strand. She is requesting permission to visit Dunmore. Mira watched his hand. The knuckles were white again. She holds a signed agreement between our families, Evander said. His voice was flat and unreadable. A pre-arranged settlement predating my father's death. She will argue it supersedes our marriage. Mira thought about the letter her father had left with a T-ring on it, and the £4,000 he had not told her about. Will you see her? He set the letter on the desk beside the map. If I refuse, she comes anyway and makes a public scene in the village and turns the tenant families against the estate before I have a chance to put anything right. If I receive her formally, at least I control the terms. Then receive her. His eyes moved to her, and it was the first time he had looked at her directly since the wedding, and she felt it the way she felt the crack of a door opening onto a cold morning, a sudden vividness, a taking in of breath. When she arrives, he said quietly, you will need to know things I have not yet told you. She folded her hands on the desk. Then tell me. He did not tell her that night. Instead, he asked her whether she was tired, and she told him truthfully that she was not. And he showed her the rest of the estate records and let her read until nearly 1 a.m. when she finally admitted that her eyes were beginning to cross, and he walked her to the base of the east staircase with a formality that felt less cold than it had at first, and said good night in a voice that was fractionally something other than flat. She lay awake in the east wing, listening to the house settle and going through what she knew, arranging the pieces the way she arranged case files, by date, by logic, by what connected to what. An earl who would not leave his house, a grip on every fixed surface he passed, as though he needed to locate himself in space. Eyes that found hers with too much precision for a man who otherwise seemed to move through the world at a careful remove. An accident 18 months ago that the servants would not discuss, and the letter from Octavia Strand, arriving the same day Mira had. That was not coincidence. She was enough of her father's daughter to know that. He came to find her 2 evenings later, which surprised her, because it was the first time he had sought her out, rather than tolerating her presence. She was at her desk writing out a boundary survey from memory. She had read the relevant document once in the case files and could reproduce it exactly when his knock came. 2 taps, careful and quiet, as though the door deserved consideration. He sat in the chair across from her desk and looked at his hands for a while before he spoke. I owe you an explanation. You owe me nothing, she said. But she put down her pen. The accident was not an accident. His voice was level. It was working hard to stay that way. Mira waited. I had been corresponding with a legal clerk in Edinburgh who had found irregularities in a property transfer executed 3 years before my father's death. A significant transfer, 4,000 acres of north pasture and 2 working mills, moved out of the Dunmore estate and into the holdings of the Strand family, based on a document that was said to bear my father's signature. She understood before he finished the sentence, but she let him finish. The document was a forgery. The clerk had written to tell me so. He had compared the signatures against 8 authenticated samples and was prepared to submit a formal affidavit to the Edinburgh court. He set the terms. If I came to Edinburgh to file the legal challenge, the case could be heard within the year and the land recovered. He was quiet. The lamp on her desk burned between them. I was 3 miles from the Edinburgh road when something struck the horse from behind. She shied and threw me. I was found 2 hours later by a farmhand. The physician said it was consistent with a fall. And the clerk in Edinburgh? He withdrew his affidavit. 3 weeks after my accident, he wrote to say he had reconsidered and found the signatures adequate after all. He stood without making it dramatic about it, and went to the window, not looking out, just standing with his shoulder to the glass. When I recovered enough to investigate further, I found that the Strand family had paid off the clerk's considerable debts in the month following my accident. Mira's fingers were very still on the desk. Octavia Strand, she said, is the daughter of the man who orchestrated the transfer. Yes, and she holds a pre-settlement agreement that was drafted, signed and witnessed by a solicitor in the same office as the forged property transfer. His voice was even. She intends to challenge our marriage, recover the 4,000 acres legally by marrying the estate's owner, and close any remaining inquiry into the original forgery by becoming, in effect, the person who would have to initiate it. Mira thought of a woman she had not yet met. She thought of the pre-settlement agreement and what it would cost to forge one and what kind of confidence it took to arrive at a man's house 18 months after trying to kill him and smile. "You need a wife who cannot be displaced," she said. "I need a wife who already knows what is in the Edinburgh clerk's original letter." He turned from the window. "Because I still have it, every word." She looked at him. "And I cannot read it. Not anymore, since the fall." He said it the same way she imagined you said a thing you had practiced, saying until it no longer felt like an admission. "My sight comes and goes. Some mornings it is nearly ordinary. Others I can read nothing at all. The physicians say it may improve. They have been saying so for 18 months. She thought of the door frames, the newel post, the wineglass that never moved from where he set it. You memorize the position of everything. It is easier than asking for help. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the grounds of Dunmore Hall were dark and still, and the lamp between them was the only light in the room, and Mira had the peculiar sensation of a person who has just understood a very large thing and needs a moment to arrange herself around it. Then she picked up her pen. "I am going to need you to tell me everything the Edinburgh letter said," she said, "and everything in the forged transfer document, if you remember it." "I remember all of it," he said, with the ghost of something that was not quite a smile. "Apparently it runs in the blood." She almost smiled back. She bent over the paper instead and began to write. They worked for 3 weeks. Evander's solicitor, a careful man from York named Briggs, who kept his opinions in his pocket and his papers in perfect order, came to stay in the east guest rooms and spent his days at the long drawing-room table surrounded by documents, while Mira stood at his elbow and recited from memory the exact wording of case law she had read once in her father's office, sometimes years before. Briggs stopped asking her to repeat herself by the second day. He simply looked at her with the expression of a man adjusting his expectations upward and wrote down whatever she said. Evander sat across the table, and Mira noticed in those weeks that he watched her, not the careful, managed watching of the first days, when he had kept his eyes at a point slightly past her shoulder. He watched her the way she had seen him watch his documents, with the close, cataloguing attention of a man who needed to know exactly where something was and was filing the information permanently. She watched him too. The grip on surfaces was worse in the mornings, and better by afternoon, which meant, she thought, that the light mattered. She found herself arranging their work sessions to take advantage of it. Documents in the afternoon, conversation in the evenings when the lamplight was stable, and the contrast less harsh. She did not tell him she was doing this. She simply did it, and one afternoon she looked up from a contract she was reading and found him looking at her in a way that suggested he had noticed. Neither of them mentioned it. Lady Maron noticed everything. She moved through the house with the quiet thoroughness of a woman who had decided observation was her contribution, and she said very little until the 4th week, when she stopped Mira in the corridor outside the drawing-room and looked at her for a long moment before she spoke. "He smiled yesterday," Maron said, "at something you said about the Edinburgh lease." I have not seen him smile in a year. Mira did not know what to do with that, so she said nothing. Maron's expression was exactly like that of a person confirming a column of figures she had already checked twice, correct as expected. She walked away. That evening, working late, they sat closer than usual over the Strand family financial records that Briggs had obtained from the Edinburgh Registry. The candle was burning low, and the papers were dense with figures. And Mira leaned forward to trace a column of numbers with her finger, and her shoulder pressed against Evander's arm, and neither of them moved. His arm was warm through the fabric of his coat. Her hand was near his on the edge of the ledger. The figures on the page stopped meaning anything for a moment. She was aware of the exact position of his hand and the exact depth of his breathing, and the fact that he had not shifted away. He stood eventually to light a fresh candle, and when he sat back down, he was a careful distance further. She did not mention it. They continued working. but something had settled between them, and they both knew it. Octavia Strand arrived on a Friday in late October, 2 days before the Berwick County Assembly. She arrived in a well-appointed carriage with a maid and a travelling secretary, and the ease of a woman who had decided well in advance how things were going to go. She was striking, tawny-haired and direct-eyed, with the kind of self-possession that comes from having been correct enough times that wrongness has stopped feeling like a realistic possibility. She swept into Dunmore Hall as though the house were already hers, and asked to see the Earl. Dinner that evening included 6 county families who had arrived at Octavia's suggestion and Evander's reluctant agreement, because Octavia had written very carefully that she wished to resolve the matter of the pre-settlement agreement in the presence of witnesses, and Evander had looked at the letter for a long time before handing it to Mira and saying, quietly, "Let her come then." At the table, Octavia sat at Evander's right hand, and she began testing him the way Mira had begun to understand. People tested him in small, careful increments designed to look accidental. The bread basket moved 2 inches to the left. His water glass shifted. The placement of the cutlery altered by a few centimetres between courses. Evander found everything without fumbling, because Mira had spent 3 weeks understanding exactly how he worked, and she had spoken to Reed that afternoon, and the table had been set in the configuration that gave Evander the best chance of navigating it without difficulty. Octavia noticed. Her eyes moved to Mira and narrowed by a fraction. Then she turned the full force of her attention across the table and smiled. "Your ladyship's family," she said, and the word landed like a calculation, "is in trade, I believe, before the magistracy." "Your grandfather was a printer," the table quieted. 6 families looked at Mira. She let the silence hold for exactly 1 beat, long enough to feel it, not long enough to seem defeated by it. "My grandfather set type." "Yes," she said. "He printed the county records for 30 years. She held Octavia's gaze, which is how I learned to read, by standing at his shoulder. I was 5 years old, and he told me that a man who controlled the records controlled the truth. I have not found a reason to disagree. The table did not exhale, but Lady Ashvale at the far end picked up her wine-glass with an expression that suggested she was revising certain assumptions. Later that night, after the guests had gone to their rooms, Mira locked her bedroom door and sat on the floor with her back against the side of the bed and let the composure crack. Not much. She was not the kind of person who gave herself much time for cracking, but she sat there with her knees drawn up and her hands over her face and let the shame and fury move through her in the order they arrived, which was shame first, hot and heavy and physical, the way it always was, and then fury, slower and deeper and worse. In trade. 2 words placed with surgical precision in front of 6 families who would carry them home and repeat them. She had answered well. She knew she had answered well. But knowing that and feeling the blow land were 2 different things, and the blow had landed, and she sat with it until she heard the knock. 2 taps, quiet and deliberate. She stood, unlocked the door, and opened it. Evander was in the corridor without the candle he usually carried. His eyes were adjusted to the dark in the way they always were when the light was low enough that the condition of his vision made little practical difference. He looked at her, and the mask he wore during the day, the managed blankness, the careful distance, was gone entirely. He said, "I am sorry." For what she said, and for the fact that I could not stop it. You couldn't. She stepped back to let him in, not without revealing what we've built. He crossed to the window and stood there in the dark with his hands at his sides, and she could feel the anger coming off him in the particular, controlled way she had come to recognize, the way the house had a draft in winter that the thick walls tried and failed to stop. "Mira," he said. The word was quiet. He used her name the way you use something you have been thinking of using and have finally decided to. She sat on the edge of the desk and looked at him and waited. He turned and looked back at her. His eyes in the dark found her face with the accuracy she had stopped being surprised by. "There is something I have not told you," he said it plainly. Not the even, recitative quality he used for estate business, but something underneath that, the voice of a man who had carried a weight for 18 months and had finally identified someone strong enough to share it. She said nothing. She waited. "His name was Owen," he said, and his voice changed when he said it, in the way voices change around the names of people who are gone. "My brother." He was younger by 4 years. He was the one who found the irregularities in the land transfer first, not the Edinburgh clerk. Owen found them, because Owen was the kind of person who read every figure twice and questioned anything that didn't add up. He brought them to me. I sent him to Edinburgh to retrieve the original documentation. He paused. The window behind him showed a sky with no moon, and the grounds below were absolutely dark. He never came back. Mira was very still. The official finding was an accident on the Edinburgh road. His horse threw him in the dark. He was found the next morning by a passing coachman. He was 26 years old, and he had done nothing except trust his brother's judgment and go where I sent him. Evander's voice was precise and without tremor, the way a voice gets when the only alternative to precision is the inability to continue. He died 3 weeks before my own accident. I went to Edinburgh because I thought if I went myself, I could finish what he started. He looked at her. The grief on his face was not raw and weeping. It was worse than that. It was the grief that has been lived with long enough to become part of the architecture. I have spent 18 months inside this house because going past the gate means being on the road where it happened, and I cannot. He stopped and started again. I have not been able to make myself. Not yet. It is the one thing I cannot control through preparation and arrangement and memorization. The road goes past the hedgerow where they found his horse, and I cannot go past it. Mira looked at him for a long time. Then she crossed the room and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers and held, and the grip was not the controlled, managing grip she had felt at the wedding, or the white-knuckled grip on door frames. It was the grip of someone who needed an anchor and had found one, and she held on and did not let go. "Owen would not have let you stay in here," she said. "No," Evander said. "He would have been furious." "Then let's be furious together," she said, "and let's finish it." They planned through the night. Briggs came up from the east wing at 7 in the morning, alarmed to find them still at the drawing-room table, then rapidly unalarmed when Mira showed him what they had, the document she had written from memory, the full text of the Edinburgh clerk's original letter, reproduced word for word, combined with the forgery analysis that Briggs had been building for 3 weeks, and the financial records that showed the payment to the clerk's creditors within days of Owen Cray's death. The Berwick County Assembly was in 2 days. Every family of consequence would be there. Octavia Strand would be there, because she could not resist a stage, and she would bring the pre-settlement agreement because it was her best argument. And she would make her move in public, because public pressure was the only tool she had left. Mira sat at her desk after Evander left, and wrote out the handwriting comparison she had been working on for a week. The pre-settlement agreement bore Evander's name in 3 places. She had read his authentic signatures on 100 documents, and she had read letters that Octavia Strand had sent to the estate steward over the past 18 months. The capital E in Evander crossed left to right, with a loop that closed at the bottom. The signatures on the pre-settlement agreement crossed right to left, the loop left open. She had seen that open loop in 2 of Octavia's letters. She wrote it all down in her clearest hand, with examples, and set it beside the Edinburgh document on the table. The Berwick Assembly was held in the great hall of the Baron House, which was large enough for 120 guests, and lit with enough candles to give everything the quality of a stage set, warm and bright and a little unreal. The county families arrived in their carriages and filed in and found their positions, and the buzz of conversation rose to the vaulted ceiling and reflected back down in a steady hum. Octavia arrived early. She wore deep amber silk and positioned herself at the centre of the room, with the confidence of a woman who had decided the conclusion of the evening in advance. Evander arrived on Mira's arm. She felt the room shift when they walked in, a reorientation of attention, a ripple of conversation that moved through the assembly like wind, moving through standing grain. She felt the eyes of people who had heard what Octavia said at dinner, and she felt the particular quality of the look that meant the printer's granddaughter. She straightened her spine and walked forward. Briggs was already in the vestibule with a county constable. He had been there since 7. Octavia moved when she saw them enter. She crossed the room with the ease of a woman who owned it, and she took the space between Evander and Mira with a naturalness that was entirely deliberate, and she drew out the pre-settlement document and held it where Lord Denholm Their host could see it. "A prior agreement between our families," she said. Her voice carried. 3 years before the current Countess's marriage. His lordship's own signature, as you can see. She smiled at Mira over the top of the document. "I am sorry, your ladyship, but the law is quite clear." Every head in the room turned. Mira stepped forward. "That is not his lordship's signature," she said. The hum of conversation stopped. 120 people did not breathe. She kept her voice exactly as steady as it was when she read depositions in her father's study. The capital E in his lordship's name crosses left to right, with a closed loop at the base. This signature crosses right to left, the loop left open. I have read 12 years of his lordship's correspondence, and I have read Miss Strand's letters to the Dunmore estate steward. The open loop is Miss Strand's. It appears in 3 of her personal letters. She turned to face Octavia directly. 6 weeks before my brother-in-law, Mr. Owen Cray, died on the Edinburgh Road. He had located irregularities in a property transfer that moved 4,000 acres from the Dunmore estate into the Strand family holdings, based on a document bearing a forged signature. His findings were confirmed by a legal clerk whose considerable debts were paid off by the Strand family within a fortnight of Owen Cray's death, the same fortnight in which the clerk withdrew his affidavit. The room was stone still. Owen Cray was 26 years old. She did not raise her voice. He died on a road in the dark, and no one investigated why his horse threw him, because the official finding was accident, and the magistrate who received the file was my own father, whose debts the Strand family also held. She turned to the document and then to the room. This pre-settlement agreement was not signed by the Earl of Dunmore. It was written by a woman who wished to marry her way to legal ownership of land that was stolen from this family. Evander set down his cane. He released Mira's arm and straightened to his full height, and turned to look at Octavia Strand with eyes that were perfectly, unambiguously focused. "Owen Cray was my brother," he said. The room held its breath. "Tell me what happened on the Edinburgh Road," Octavia stumbled. Not literally, not quite, but there was a step back, and her hand caught the back of a chair, and the pre-settlement agreement slipped in her grip, and the edge of it crumpled. "The constable is in the vestibule," Mira said. "He has been there since 7. The room parted. Briggs came through the vestibule doors with the constable beside him, and 2 documents in hand, the forged agreement and the full reconstruction of the Edinburgh correspondence that Mira had written from memory. Octavia looked at the door. She looked at Evander. She looked at Mira. Her mouth opened and closed. She did not make a scene. That, Mira thought, was the most revealing thing about her. She had always calculated. She calculated now, looked at the numbers, and found them wrong, and walked out between the constable and Briggs with her chin level, and her face the colour of old ash. The doors closed. 120 people exhaled simultaneously. The consequences arrived across the following weeks, methodical and public. The pre-settlement agreement was entered into evidence. The original land transfer document was submitted to the Edinburgh court, alongside the handwriting analysis and the financial records. The Edinburgh clerk, faced with the documented timeline of his debt payment, reconsidered his earlier reconsideration, and his original affidavit was reinstated. The 4,000 acres and the 2 mills were ruled improperly transferred and returned to the Dunmore estate. Thomas Fenn, magistrate of Whitmore Parish, was stripped of his position by order of the county bench. At Mira's request, the only request she made on his behalf, he was permitted to retire quietly to a cottage in Lincolnshire. She did not visit him before he left. She wrote him a short letter. She did not tell him about the letter. She simply wrote it, sealed it, and handed it to the post-rider. Evander spoke to the assembly before they left Barron House, in the quiet after Octavia's arrest, when the room was still rearranging itself around what it had witnessed. "My wife," he said, and the room heard the words, "the Countess of Dunmore is the most capable woman I have ever known. Everything she has said tonight is true." He paused, "and I see her very clearly." The room began to applaud, starting with Lord Denholm and spreading until it filled the vaulted ceiling and reflected down. Lady Marin, seated near the front with her wineglass in hand, lifted it in Mira's direction with the expression of a person who has been right about something for quite a long time and is allowing herself a moment of visible satisfaction. The carriage home was dark and quiet. The lamps rocked gently on their hooks. Evander had left his cane at Barron House. He would not, Mira thought, need it again. For a long time they sat across from each other and said nothing. Outside, the road ran north through the dark, and at some point it passed the hedgerow where Owen Cray's horse had been found, and Evander looked out the window when they reached it, and then he looked at Mira. She reached across and took his hand. He held it. He said, "I married you because I needed someone who already knew the truth and couldn't be moved from it." She looked at him. She felt with his hand in hers, and the road unspooling behind them, that the carriage was carrying her towards something she had not had a name for yet, but was beginning to recognize. "I know what I married you for," she said. "Tell me what you want." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want you to stay. Not for Owen, not for the land or the evidence or the 4,000 acres. For me." She looked at his face in the dark, the sharpness of it, and the openness of it, and the careful hope in it, which was more frightening to him than anything else in the room. And she knew it. "You found me on the road," she said, "and told me the truth when everyone else was still managing me. I've been staying since the night you came to my door." He pressed her hand against his chest. She felt his heartbeat, steady and fast and human, nothing like the controlled performance of it, and she left her hand there until the carriage turned through the iron gates of Dunmore Hall, and the gravel crunched beneath the wheels, and the house rose before them, dark-stoned and lit from inside, looking, for the first time since she had arrived, something like welcoming. 2 years later, Dunmore was unrecognisable. The west wing and the east wing were connected by the drawing room they had made their own, desk beside desk, papers commingled on the surface. The cane stood in the corner of the study, where it had stood since November, unused and quietly superfluous. Evander's vision had improved steadily through the winter, and though mornings were still difficult, and probably always would be, he no longer memorized the position of every object in every room he entered. He let things be where they happened to be, and he looked for them, and Mira thought this small, ordinary thing was the bravest change she had seen in her life. The north pasture was producing again. The 2 mills were running. The tenants on the boundary road had stopped filing complaints, largely because Mira had read every grievance personally, and Evander had acted on each one. Mr. Fowler had the irrigation rights he was owed. The Hardacre family had the boundary marker corrected. It had taken an afternoon. On a morning in late spring, Mira stood at the library window and watched Evander in the courtyard below with a child on his shoulders, a boy, 7 months old and enormously pleased with his height advantage, who gripped 2 fistfuls of his father's dark hair and regarded the rose bushes with the lordly satisfaction of a person surveying territory. Evander was pointing out a sparrow in the hedge. He explained the sparrow at length and with great seriousness. The child was unimpressed by the explanation, but delighted by the pointing. Lady Marin arrived at noon, as she did every Thursday, with opinions about the child's footwear and a seed cake that was, she maintained, not for anyone under 2. She sat beside Evander in the courtyard and looked at the boy for a long moment. "He has Owen's eyes," she said. Evander's hand stilled on his son's back. Then he said, "Yes, he does." It was the first time Mira had heard him say her brother-in-law's name without grief reshaping his voice around it. The wound was there. She knew it was there. She knew it would always be there, the way certain things do not heal so much as become part of the person who carries them. But he said the name, and the name held, and the child on his shoulders blinked his inherited eyes at the hedge and grabbed another fistful of hair. That afternoon, a letter arrived from Briggs. Mira opened it at her desk. The Strand family trial was set for Michaelmas term. The Crown would require her testimony. Briggs enclosed a secondary note, marked for her attention alone. She read it twice because the first time she thought she had misread it. A second name had appeared in the financial records from the Edinburgh Registry. Not Octavia Strand's father. Not anyone whose name Mira had encountered in 18 months of documents and case files and reconstructed correspondence. Someone who had sent money to the Edinburgh clerk a full 3 months before the Strand family had. 3 months before Owen Cray went to Edinburgh at all. Someone who had known the inquiry was coming before it had officially begun. Someone who had been expecting it. Mira set the letter on the desk and looked through the window at the courtyard, where Evander was still explaining something to his son about the sparrow. He looked up as though he had felt her look, the way he always did now. His eyes found hers through the glass, steady and clear, and he read her expression in a way that had nothing to do with the state of his vision and everything to do with the preceding 2 years. She picked up her pen. There was more to do.